Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Joe Rogan Experience of Lost Literacy. There are many great authors of the past who have survived centuries of oblivion and neglect, but it is still an open question whether they will be able to survive an entertaining version of what they have to say. Hannah Arendt, The Crisis in Culture. Well, hi everybody, and this is a slightly unusual video for this channel because I want to do a relatively short response, well I say short, let's see how long it goes on for, but a piece in response to this by now quite viral interview that Joe Rogan did with, on the top there on the right, Dave Smith, and below him Douglas Murray. And why I'm picking on it and using it as an example is I think it encapsulates quite a few themes of this channel relating to the importance of literacy and the importance of art and the values in modern contemporary mass media, well sorry, not mass media, social media dominated society. And I think a lot of these issues came up inadvertently sometimes and also directly in this talk. So just to give some initial background, the Dave Smith is an ex-comedian. I hadn't encountered him before this video, so shame on me, but he's an enthusiastic historian. He has an abiding interest in Israel-Gaza conflict, and apparently also has an ongoing long interest in the Second World War. And as part of that interest, he has defended or championed, or I don't want to use loaded terms, but he himself has called a guy called Daryl Cooper a national treasure, and we'll get on to the Daryl Cooper character in a second. So, and Daryl Cooper has said some controversial things about Churchill, amongst other things. So that's Dave Smith. And on the other side, you have in this, it's interview stroke more like a debate, Douglas Murray, who's a British journalist. I think he may be a naturalised American, or he's living in America now, who has written a series of books all about the decline of Western culture, uncontrolled immigration, and these sorts of issues. And he's also travelled and reported on war zones like the Gaza conflict and like Ukraine. And they were two of the key themes that came up in the talk. But what I'd ask is for people not to fixate or focus. Obviously, these are hugely important issues that were discussed. But I'm more interested, not that I'm not interested in these hugely important issues, but I want to ask you to reflect upon the way in which they tended in this interview to speak past each other. And especially in the first approximately 50 minutes, Joe Rogan and Dave Smith really struggled to understand the point, or to recognise the point that Douglas Murray was actually making. And I don't think it was a particularly difficult point. So what fascinated me was why it took so long. And I'm not even sure they got it at the end of the 50 minutes. Now, some of that could be put on Douglas Murray, and I've seen people in the comments saying that he didn't express himself well. That may or may not be true. That's up for you to decide. And I've put all the videos I'm going to refer to, descriptions in the description channel, links to them. I interpreted it slightly different. I empathise with him because I've been in a vaguely similar situation. It's the frustration I saw from him. Not so much that they weren't agreeing with him, but because they weren't understanding what they were disagreeing with. So I'll talk about this as we go along, but I think the key, crucial, main issue that came out of the whole talk was who gets to speak in the public square and why are they speaking. And that became a huge bone of contention that we'll explore as we go along. Now, just quickly to give some of my background, and because I think it's important to get not that you're interested in my background, but to get your own biases or potential biases out of the way. So I hadn't encountered Dave Smith, and in this initial discussion, I was quite sympathetic to him, although I think in terms of substance, I sided more with Douglas Murray's actual argument. But as I did more research, I think, and looked at not what other people had said, but what Dave Smith had himself argued in various interviews, I think there's an element of bad faith that went on in this debate, which I'll explain shortly. On the other side, I'm not a fanboy of Douglas Murray. I admire some of his work, but just to give you a very specific example, he has done a bit of a hatchet job in some of his writing on the French historian stroke philosopher Michel Foucault, who he accused, and there is some contentious evidence that he groomed young boys, adolescent boys in Tunisia at one point in his life. And so he does some ad hominem attacks on Foucault, as well as blaming him for a lot of the decline of Western civilization and the way the universities have gone. And I'd make two quick points on that. I profoundly disagree in Douglas Murray's reading of Foucault. And that's neither here nor there, except it's quite ironic, because as part of this debate that Joe Rogan, Dave Smith, and Douglas Murray had, this issue of who gets to speak and who is an expert and who isn't. And ironically, I don't think Douglas Murray is enough of an expert to speak authoritatively about Michel Foucault. So he was hoisted by his own petard in that sense. So that's just one interesting point, and also to show that I'm under no illusion that Douglas Murray is not holier than thou. I think he made mistakes during the talk, and I also think there's a slight whiff of hypocrisy. The other slight aspect about the whole Foucault thing is, I'm not disputing that Foucault may or may not have been a terrible human being. Personally, I'm not very interested in the biographical details of great thinkers, and I think he was a great thinker. I could also mention, and I think I'll talk later on, I've written a book about, co-written a book about Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, German philosopher, horrible human being, but that doesn't really detract from the importance of his work. Jean-Paul Sartre, not a very nice guy, very important philosopher. So this idea that, the importance of someone's work is undermined by who they might be, I completely dispute. And that goes directly to the issue of personalities. And that is one of the things that I think is an overarching context for this Joe Rogan interview. The idea that a lot of the responses, which I've skimmed through the comment section of the Joe Rogan YouTube site, for example, there's a lot of ad hominem personality issues involved. So ironically, with an accent like mine, I felt a bit defensive towards Douglas Murray. He has this crystal glass cut British accent, which I think winds up North Americans sometimes. On the one hand, we love your accent, but when things get a bit stressful, I think inverse snobbery kicks in, and I think he's been picked on for his accent, which he can't help any more than I can help mine, which is the diametric opposite of Douglas Murray's. So there's that aspect, there's the personalised, and this goes with the territory. One of the issues is they're having a discussion about some conceptual issues, but it's in an entertainment format, which I'll expand upon shortly. It's in an entertainment format. You can't help but witness what you're seeing if you're watching it on YouTube or listening to the timbre of voice in the podcast version. And this distracts from, you become absorbed in, and absorption is an idea that I'll pursue in a second, but you become absorbed in the particularities of this entertainment fodder rather than the substance of what's being said. And I find that quite disturbing, actually. But before I witter on, I just want to go into the specifics of the various videos that you could actually unpack some of these issues through. So I'm calling it the video chain, but there's the initial interview that I'm referring to. But before that, and I think it's important to, if you possibly have the time, go to the description section and see with the links for these videos and check them out. And I think you can see the chain of the argumentative aspects to all of this. So previously, Dave Smith was on the Piers Morgan show, and Dave Smith was discussing a friend and someone he says he admires, Darryl Cooper, who's an amateur historian. And on the same show was a guy called Andrew Roberts, who's arguably the world's most authoritative source and biographer on Churchill. And what comes across in that interview is Andrew Roberts completely, just factually, forget my interpretation or anybody else's, factually points out glaring errors in Darryl Cooper's analysis of Churchill. And even though Dave Smith, who says he admires Darryl Cooper's work, witnesses this complete rejection on a factual basis of Darryl Cooper's argument, it doesn't seem to register with him. It doesn't seem to, the actual facts, despite the fact Dave Smith comes across as quite reasonable, and in the debate with Douglas Murray, arguably is more polite and less sanctimonious and less pompous. He's quite generous of spirit, I would say, because he doesn't rise to the bait. But underlying this is this seeming immunity to being bothered by facts, which, again, we can discuss that as well. Now, this Darryl Cooper character, I'd, again, never heard of, but he's this popular, very successful podcaster. He was on, even earlier, the Tucker Carlson show, and this is the substance of what the Piers Morgan discussion was about. Some of the claims Darryl Cooper makes about Churchill. And then, after all of this, so it's quite convoluted and quite complicated, but interesting nonetheless. There have been various already in the few days since this video went, the original Joe Rogan video went out. There have been some responses. And I've just picked out, Gad Saad did a 10-minute short video called Beware of Credentialism, where, as a big fan of Douglas Murray, he critiques Douglas Murray's purported argument based upon credentialism. And I found it quite interesting because I just think at various points, Gad Saad, I think he said he'd only listened to the first 50 minutes, whilst I think he might have said while he was driving with his family. So there's another issue about the way you consume concepts as a form of background noise or entertainment, because I don't think Gad Saad, even he, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, I think he must have been distracted, he wasn't listening properly, but he misrepresents what Douglas Murray was saying. And this is the phenomenon that came out of this whole chain of interviews and the original Joe Rogan interview that I find quite disturbing, might be the word, but that very intelligent people are seemingly not getting basic aspects of what's going on or what's being said, even before they then choose to agree or disagree. And I would suggest it's because the way in which these ideas are being presented does not lend itself for reflection or contemplation. The cut and thrust and the entertainment values that overlay these type of presentations or debates or interviews are a massive distraction from the actual conceptual content, to the point that very bright people like Gad Saad can miss what's going on because they're so distracted. So I'll explain. I'm not going to just make the accusation Gad Saad's misunderstood it. I'm going to explain in a second this issue of credentialism. It was part of what Douglas Murray was saying, but not the totality. And I would suggest that Dave Smith, in the interview I've just mentioned that he did with Piers Morgan, has shown himself immune to well-reasoned, well-credentialed arguments that completely undermine the person that he's supporting. So this credentialism thing, Gadsad makes the point that you shouldn't always rely on it, and I agree. But it's not quite what Douglas Murray was saying. He wasn't saying we should only listen to credentialed people, but he said they are important and they should have a room at the table. And I think Gadsad's overcompensated by picking on this issue of credentialism, but I'll go into that more. So this all made me think, as I was witnessing all this, I used this as an epigraph to a book I wrote years ago called, it was a Critical Theories of Mass Media, Then and Now, which was an academic book. But I think it's a beautiful description from it's a very average novel. It's not a brilliant novel, it's a good novel. But I just loved this quotation from it. I was witnessing a time when most things, including hard cash and our perception of reality itself, were about to be turned into an idea of themselves. I began to notice the insistence of image over substance, and this insistence began to pester me, like a bad radio station that you can't afford to turn off. We were just that bit too old to buy into the rumble of a world described by advertising and products. That was the world where everything had turned into an idea of itself, where life no longer had an inner life. It's a process which just seems to have built up, like an accumulation of fat around the heart's weary muscle. Which, given how unfit I am, it's a bit close to home, that last comment. But this is a literary way of describing, I think, some of what's going on in the mutual incomprehension that took place in the Joe Rogan discussion. So I'm using this phrase, paths in the fog, because that was one of the references Douglas Murray made. It's a Milan Kundera essay, Testaments Betrayed as the collection title, I think, but this was one of the essays, Paths in the Fog. And that was one interesting aspect. You're likely to get quotations from people like Milan Kundera, Czech novelist, from Douglas Murray. You're not so likely to get those quotations from Joe Rogan or Dave Smith. And that's not me being snobbish, but it does go to the notion of a frame of reference. Douglas Murray, for all his faults, has a literate frame of reference, whereas Joe Rogan and Dave Smith, I think, are much more immersed in the podcast environment, where it's the entertainment and the provocation and the clickbaits. Or I'm not claiming that Joe Rogan always just goes after clickbaits, because I think he genuinely talks to people he finds interesting, and he coincidentally happens to become very famous because it seems to be a very natural process. He's very charismatic, and it's obviously been hugely successful. But it should still be recognised. You can admire Joe Rogan and his, avuncular personality, but I think you could also be aware that it's not literate. He's not claiming to be a great scholar. But that has some interesting consequences. So this is why I became so fascinated with this interview, and why I found it so relevant to what I was trying to do on this channel. It's almost like the last gasp of literate culture was embodied in Douglas Murray when he's trying to have this discussion. For all the faults, for all the pomposity, for all the snarkiness that came out of Douglas during the debate, I did empathise with his inability to get through to the two people when he's making a relatively simple point, which the simple point that just didn't seem to get through specifically was Douglas Murray was questioning why people like Dave Smith talk on issues like the Israel-Gaza conflict without having any apparent background or expertise or credentials, to quote Gadsad. And he wasn't saying they didn't have the right to speak. And this is what both Dave Smith and Joe Rogan kept saying, but you're saying we can't speak. He wasn't saying that, and he made a snarky comment. Well, you are speaking. It was more a normative issue about should you be speaking? And if you are speaking about these issues, which is fair enough, totally right, when you become as powerful as Joe Rogan, when you have 20 million followers or whatever he has, when you indulge non-credentialed people without offering credentialed people or balancing it with credentialed people who have certain expertise, who that doesn't mean they're the only ones who should be listened to, or their credentialed expertise automatically outweighs the keen amateur. But when there are provocative claims made, as Daryl Cooper does, that has the consequence, because they're entertaining, because they're provocative, they get many more clicks than any serious, genuine, credentialed historian is ever going to. Douglas Murray's point was, at least you should have some balance. And when Piers Morgan, to be fair to him, which I'm not often, when he gets Andrew Roberts, this world expert, and Dave Smith cannot engage with the substance of what Andrew Roberts is saying, the facts. So he just seems to displays some like psychological disassociation. He doesn't deal, and he says, I'm not going to stop admiring Daryl Cooper's work. Well, you've just heard him be absolutely demolished by an expert, and yet you have this emotional investment in still being interested in an amateur historian who's just factually wrong on many issues. So why was it that this lost comprehension in the debate with Joe Rogan? Why aren't they getting for 50 minutes? It's not even a complex nuance, but Douglas Murray was just saying, you need balance. And yes, it's your perfect First Amendment right to say whatever you want. But when you become that popular, when Joe Rogan has that audience, couldn't he just have a bit more balance? Couldn't he just have a few more actual experts who could then themselves be interrogated? No one's saying give the experts a free pass. So this issue of expertise, I think one of the reasons Joe Rogan is so popular and so famous is he comes across as, to coin a phrase, an average Joe. But the phrase punching jelly was used by Douglas Murray when he addressed the issue of expertise. And the minute you use the issue of expertise, someone like Dave Smith says, yeah, but I'm just an ex-comedian. So why are you saying I should have more expertise? I'm just talking about these things because I'm interested. And I think what Douglas Murray meant about punching jelly is, well, why are you engaging in conceptually complex stuff? And then the minute you're challenged, say, well, I'm just a comedian. You either do it in all seriousness and defend your position, but don't fall back upon the I'm not an expert. There does seem to be a bit of inconsistency there. You can argue it doesn't matter at all that you have no expertise, but at least argue that. I think that would be a very problematic way to go. But this, when you're pushed into a corner just to fall back upon the fact you're not an expert, when I think Douglas Murray then went on to say, well, if you're not an expert, why are you? It's fine to talk about whatever issue you want to. But in Dave Smith's case, why has he spent, I think it's around, almost, it's getting on for years. He's talking about Israel, Gaza so consistently and so repetitively. That implies why would people listen to him unless he had some type of expertise? And the issue is, well, they're not listening to him because he's got expertise. I think they're listening to him because he has an enthusiasm, he has a certain charisma, he has a certain plausibility, and this helps to build up a huge audience. And Joe Rogan does that on steroids, so to speak. That's not it's not an accusation. That was a turn of phrase. But I think Douglas Murray was raising a very important point. This has consequences. If it was just entertainment, If they're just shooting the breeze, then of course joke, talk about what you want. But when you're talking about world events, or when you're talking about world history, and there's factual errors, and they're not balanced by people who can point them out because they're just experts in the area, that fosters ignorance. And I don't think it's enough of an excuse to say, I'm just a comedian. And another issue that came up that caused a lot of grief was when Douglas Murray took offence when he learnt that Dave Smith had never been to the region around the Israel-Gaza conflict. And in the comments, I've noticed there's a lot of sneering at Douglas Murray for pointing out that maybe if you're going to talk about something for such a length of time and so consistently, then perhaps, I think he used the phrase, you should do the courtesy of going to that region. And Douglas Murray is a journalist, and he's gone to the Ukraine, and he's gone to the Israel-Gaza area and Egypt and all around the areas he tends to write about. And that raises the question, do you have to go somewhere to have an opinion? Of course you don't. That's, again, not what he was saying. He was saying, if you're going to talk about something for a long period of time and in detail, and by association imply that you have quite a lot of knowledge, then to gain full knowledge, if you, from a journalistic point of view, of course there's no substitute for going to the area, to speaking to people on the ground, and for increasing any knowledge you've gained from reading, comparing it with the evidence of your own eyes, personal testimony from various people. This is just the basis of good investigative journalism. Why wouldn't you do it? And that's a question I don't think Dave Smith ever answered, apart from he kept saying it's a non-argument. You don't have to go. No, you don't have to. But a serious journalist would. And that's when you go into this circuitous, but I'm not a serious journalist, I'm just a comedian. Great. Well, stick to making jokes and don't keep talking about the same issue you're not prepared to do serious journalism about, while simultaneously being serious about it. So that's the geographical travel. And then in the discussion, Dave Smith said to Douglas Murray, you can't travel back to Nazi Germany, so does that mean no one can talk about it? And that raises interesting aspects, because no, you can't time travel, but you can read the evidence as Andrew Roberts has. You can immerse yourself in archives for decades of your life. You can do the hard yards that no matter how keen an amateur you are, you cannot replicate that level of dedicated expertise and knowledge. You can approximate towards it, but you cannot, in any charitable universe, Darryl Cooper is not of the same intellectual or knowledgeable standing as Andrew Roberts, as became clear in the Piers Morgan interview. So, no, you can't time travel, but you can do something very similar. And it brings the broader issue to me about the mindset of the current generation that increasingly wants to cancel history. Dave Smith isn't cancelling history, he's actively fascinated by it, so is Darryl Cooper. But they seem to want to deal with history under their own terms in this type of what I'll call later on an eternal now. They want to talk about history from a current context as they find it interesting, rather than, in my view, pay enough respect to the historical material itself and do the research you may not particularly want to, but feel honour bound as a scholar to actually do. And this cancellation of history in current climate, I'm not saying Darryl Cooper and Dave Smith are cancelling history, But I think they're operating within an environment within which people either accept amateur historians as the real deal, or, which is still better than the other aspect, which is students refusing to engage with history or judging history by today's standards and trying to cancel people from the past who have views that they don't like, which strikes me as just so immensely puerile. And then another aspect, I think, that provides context to the chat or the interview that Joe Rogan conducted. I'd ask you to think about the anti-intellectual bias that exists in society. And there are lots of reasons that came up in the discussion not to trust experts. There are lots of reasons not to always believe or always even admire intellectuals. But it just does interest me if, for example, Joe Rogan, I don't think anyone would dispute, from a physical point of view, mixed martial arts expert, could absolutely batter Douglas Murray and Dave Smith probably at the same time in a cage fight. No one has any problem saying that because it's so blatantly obvious and it's a physical ability. But I think Douglas Murray strikes me as intellectually superior to Dave Smith and Joe Rogan. But the minute you say that, it seems incredibly sneering and, ooh, you like to think of yourself as an intellectual. I think there's an inbuilt bias into the word intellectual, when all it's describing really is level of knowledge, ability to think and conceptualize. And because, of course, everyone's allowed an opinion, everyone should have the free right to express their opinion. Just because that's true, I think makes us tend to be biased and think there's a democracy of intellect, when just like there are stronger, fitter, better martial artists than the lazy, out-of-condition people like myself, there is not an exact, but there is some type of conceptual similarity or parallel. There are people who are mentally unfit, who are mentally lazy, who are mentally unprepared, but the minute you point that out, you're somehow being cruel or sneering. I just think there's an inconsistency. And this idea of, excuse me, that's not the same as saying reading is all that matters, or that intellectuals are the only game in town. I would balance that with just a personal example. I've done jury service twice in my life, and it made a big impression on me because I've really got it's only when you do it you get the tangible sense. I'm sounding like Douglas Murray saying you have to go somewhere to experience it, but there's an element of truth. When I did jury service, I got this very strong sense of the wisdom of 12 good citizens acting in good faith. It wasn't about how bright they were, it was about how honestly they addressed the evidence that was presented to them. And I could envisage a situation where I would, for example, in discussions, over-intellectualize the evidence and be corrected by basic common sense or insights that were much more practical. And I found the whole interaction between 12 peers a really interesting corrective to the idea that only intellect should dominate our society. So that's just to get it out straight. I'm not some idea of Plato's Republic where only the philosopher kings are allowed any power. I don't believe that. But I do think there's a role for the power of intellect, and it should be recognized and respected. And I think we have much easier time respecting physical prowess, and we seem to have this inbuilt bias against recognizing intellectual prowess. And then I'll finish later on just with this distinction between why I bang on and on and on, and people can't shut me up about the importance of literacy and literature and art, is that it encourages a notion of contemplation, it encourages reflection, which are distinct from absorption. And I think the Joe Rogan interview, it was absorbing. This is what it illustrates. It was an absorbing encounter. It was entertaining. But at the same time, through being absorbed, through being entertained, I think we miss the conceptual significance of what's going on. And what's going on is the way in which concepts are not the things that are being most valued. It's the charisma of Joe Rogan, it's the plausibility and generosity of spirit and politeness of Dave Smith in this instance, versus the snootiness, or the perceived snootiness, the perceived affronted nature of Douglas Murray, who isn't particularly charitable on the day, because I think he's frustrated, as I've explained. So this idea of the last gasp, the lost comprehension. I've said here the first 40 minutes. I'd need to go back, but it was probably just under 50 minutes. And there just seemed to be... initially, I thought Douglas Murray could have expressed himself better. And then, on reflection, I think, for whatever reason people want to interpret, I think Joe Rogan and Dave Smith were either not able to or not willing to actually listen to the point being made, which was not that they didn't have a right to speak, but that they should take their right to speak seriously and realise that given the power they have, they should seek credentialed counterbalances to what they say. Otherwise, false information, I hate this notion of disinformation, because I genuinely believe the marketplace of ideas and everyone should be allowed to speak. But in a system of podcasting and YouTube that's inherently biased towards entertainment and absorption, I think what Douglas Murray kept saying was there's a danger here that genuine facts just get overridden, or genuine expertise needs to be introduced as a counterbalance, or there are dangers ahead. And I just don't see that as a controversial point at all. But it wasn't understood as such. So I'd summarise, and I think at one point, around about 45 to 47 minutes, I think in exasperation, Douglas Murray actually becomes a lot clearer. But then I think he was in a double bind, because if he'd spoken and reduced it to the bare essentials from the get-go, because I don't think he was being particularly complicated, but then I think he would have been accused of being condescending and speaking to Joe Rogan and Dave Smith like they were children. So he spoke to them like adults, but they continued not to hear what he was saying. And I think you could just summarise it by saying he was saying there's free speech, which he's totally in favour of, as am I, but there's also worthwhile speech. And yes, Joe Rogan and Dave Smith may be immensely successful podcasters, but part of that is because they sacrifice at least somewhat worthwhile speech in order to be entertaining or to go after what's most interesting, but not necessarily the most true. And then the different registers. So again, without claiming that Douglas Murray is the pure embodiment of literate culture, in this particular confrontation, he was somewhat. So he mentions Milan Kundera, whereas I could do a whole, perhaps I will eventually, I'll put a whole video on, I've noticed it, the notion, I'm calling it comic non sequiturs. A non sequitur in philosophy being an argument that doesn't follow from one premise to the next bit of the argument. The connection's just not there. And I've noticed comics do this. So I've seen Bill Burr, who's had a bit of an odd change from being a very critical person to being very woke. But he does it, and other comics do, and I think it's part of the comic ability to take a premise and manipulate it and make fun of it and contrast things, but it's not always logical because they're trying to be funny. And at various points, I think Dave Smith did that. He made a false equivalence and then developed it. And Douglas Murray, I can disagree with some of the things he says, but there's an acknowledgement of logic and there's a use of logic that I don't think Dave Smith follows. As I've mentioned, when logic and facts are presented to him in the case of Andrew Roberts, he just sidesteps it. And I think Douglas Murray, I'm sure he does sidestep certain issues because that's what happens in debates. But by and large, I think he tries to engage with the substance of a discussion. And what that leads to is this notion of an eternal now. This is what I would criticize Joe Rogan and Dave Smith for. I think because they lack the frame of reference someone like Douglas Murray has, I think you get caught in this situation where you are in an eternal now. Everything's fresh, everything's absorbing, everything's interesting. But this does have consequences. So I think this is James Joyce, who's a brilliant wordsmith, but he talked about right words in rote order. But this notion of in pre-literate societies, they had rituals, they had incantations, they used words differently to us. And I think we're now existing in a post-literate society where we're returning to almost this incantatory, I can't even say it. We use incantations almost, we use formulas. There's the dreaded algorithm of YouTube and other search engines. It's not about pure truth, pure concept, not that, it's always disputable, but we're not driven by the ideal anymore. We're driven by what fits the algorithm. We're driven by what fits the model of entertainment. So that creates, like I say, the algorithm, but this tautological social media. Social media promote what social media are best at promoting. It's just this tautological, endless cycle of clickbait. Anything that requires more contemplation, more reflection, is going to struggle. It's not going to fit the algorithm. And part of this is the notion of the eternal now. It's like Marshall McLuhan said, whoever discovered water, it wasn't a fish. This is the problem. We're in this sea of an eternal now, to mix metaphors. And fish don't read, fish don't reflect upon the fact they're in water. And I think that the podcast environment, the YouTube environment, to some extent, it's fish in water. There's no stepping back, there's no reflecting, there's no distance. And I think I might mention this at the beginning, I'm going senile, I can't remember, but the idea that, at least in the initial comments on the Joe Rogan YouTube channel, I'm just not scientific, but there was about 95% were anti Douglas Murray. And I'm wondering, given what was being said, the actual substance of it, and backed up by the fact a lot of the comments called him snooty, called him pompous, basically had to go for being posh and English, which I think, like I might have said, is inverse snobbery. But I'm always suspicious when the bovine masses move as a herd. It makes me think something, is going on underneath the surface that just makes me suspicious. Not that I'm a conspiracy theorist, but it's just that I have this innate resistance to bovine herd-like behaviour. And I did find it interesting that the herd went against Douglas Murray. And I think that relates to the concept of online tribalism, which again I think is an underlying point. Douglas Murray didn't make it explicitly, but when you have uncorrected, provocative notions put forward by keen amateurs, it reinforces, because there isn't a countervailing, counterbalancing point of view, the tribalism gets reinforced. And to say that, for example, America between red and blue isn't probably more tribal than it's ever been, same as the UK. And online social media forums just encourage this, because to be really fair to Joe Rogan, I think at least Douglas Murray was having this argument on his channel. So to the extent that he's given Douglas Murray a voice, more power to Joe's elbow. It's just, I think Douglas was arguing it doesn't happen often enough. Not that Douglas Murray gets to speak on Joe Rogan quite often, I think, but the idea that the countervailing voice on a specific issue, I don't think gets put forward often enough. And on the one level, I totally understand Joe Rogan and Dave Smith are under no obligation. They're incredibly successful podcasters. But I think part of the circularity of the argument was, with that popularity comes certain connotations of seriousness, because they keep talking about serious issues. They're not talking about mixed martial arts. They're not talking about comedy. They're talking about serious issues. So you would think that would come with some type of responsibility to be as objective as possible, to be as balanced as possible. Whereas what you get is, as I've mentioned in the comments, rather than the ideas and the substance, Douglas Murray's personality, people have had to go at that. His accent, they've had to go at that. And I just think this is encouraged by the format. So this issue of expertise and your average Joe, I came across this great comment and this observation in the comment section. You don't have to be a carpenter to notice a wobbly table leg. Well, that's true. But if you're going to fix the wobbly table leg, being a carpenter is quite useful. So there's two aspects to that. Then there's science versus ideological capture. And I think post-pandemic, this idea that don't trust the experts, I think, has become quite prevalent. And my counter-argument would be, it wasn't the science that was at fault. It was the ideological capture of scientists who actually betrayed science by not doing everything that Douglas Murray and I would argue is necessary. You have scientists with competing views, or you should have, arguing out. And in the pandemic, I get the sense, I don't know as much about the US, but in the UK, the scientists spoke with one unilateral voice because that's what the government wanted. That's not independent science. And in somewhere like Sweden, for example, they took a completely different approach. And that was a debate that wasn't had in the UK. There were credentialed scientists who profoundly disagreed with what was happening in the UK. But there wasn't a proper, frank and full discussion. There wasn't balance. And so that ideological capture occurs because of institutionalized knowledge. People in big bureaucracies and institutions don't act always in good faith. Which again, it just goes back to this idea that you need balance. If you think of YouTube and Joe Rogan operating within the institution of podcasting, that still occurs. The ideological capture exists where I think Joe Rogan and Dave Smith aren't reflective enough upon the things I've been talking about, and Douglas Murray was frustratingly trying to express their responsibility to the thing they claim they want to promote and support, worthwhile speech. If it's just free speech they want to support, fine. They're under no obligation to have balance. But they seem to me to want to claim that they're engaging in worthwhile, interesting speech. Well, if that's true, make it as worthwhile as you possibly can. Which links to why don't they always do that? Because not just institutionalized knowledge that scientists suffer from, but commercialized knowledge. There are commercial pressures, both subtle and non-subtle, that encourage Dave Smith and Joe Rogan to engage in discussions in a particular way that will be, I'm not claiming it's the only motivation, because like I say, Joe Rogan's become incredibly famous without seemingly pursuing fame. But he does have adverts. He does commercially benefit. And I think that exerts an influence. And just one interesting thing to think about. Would people listen to Douglas Murray talk about mixed martial arts or comedy? I certainly wouldn't. But somehow, if Joe Rogan and Dave Smith are talking about serious issues, Douglas Murray's not allowed to point out their lack of credentials. They would certainly point out his lack of credentials if he spoke seemingly authoritatively about mixed martial arts and comedy. So there does seem to be a genuine asymmetry that people skate over. And this is all covered in, if you go back into the type of French theory that Douglas Murray ironically wouldn't approve of. But Guy Debord, his famous book from the 60s, and then he revisited it, I think it was 1988 or thereabouts. But he did this collection of almost aphoristic observations, the Society of the Spectacle. Society's just become a spectacle. It's lost its conceptual substance, is the basic argument. And I think that's where the notion of virtue signalling comes from. We don't have conceptual substance for all the reasons I've been talking about. So what we're left with is signalling. And to some extent, Dave Smith, and to a lesser extent Douglas Murray, but also especially Joe Rogan, their celebrity becomes the justification for the substance of what they're saying. And celebrities, this is a phrase from Daniel Boorstin, an American writer, The Image, A Guide to Pseudo-Events in America, I think it was 1961. But he talks about celebrities as tautologies in human form. So, in other words, another way of thinking about it is celebrities are famous for being famous. You listen to Dave Smith talking about Israel-Gaza because Dave Smith's talking about Israel-Gaza, not because he's an expert, not because he might actually know what he's talking about, or he may. But there's a reason why you're watching a comic talk about political events, and it's not to do with the conceptual substance. Well, there you go. I preempted myself. But this is from that book. Our experience tends more and more to become tautology, needless repetition of the same in different words and images. Celebrity is made simple familiarity, induced and reinforced by public means. The celebrity is therefore the perfect embodiment of tautology. The most familiar is the most familiar. And this is, I get the strong sense that this is Darryl Cooper. This is the plausibility of someone who becomes famous for being famous about talking about what's made him famous. Whereas Andrew Roberts is a relatively famous historian, or as famous as historians can be, but not because he's talking about things to make himself famous, because there's actual substance behind what he's doing. And I do think the difference is important, and Douglas Murray was trying to point it out. I think that's perfectly valid. So I wanted to quickly go back to this idea of time and geographical travel versus literacy. it's interesting that when Douglas Murray said you should actually go and visit, and you should, he says to Dave Smith, you should go to this area. If you're going to talk about Israel Gaza, you should go to it. You should experience it. And there's been a bit of kickback. There's been a bit of reaction to that. Well, except I think the same people who are kicking back against Douglas Murray would be the first ones to say to groups like Queers for Palestine, maybe you should go and see what it's like and see which building you might be thrown off just for being gay. So I'm pointing out that this idea of you sometimes, not always, but sometimes going to the place that you're talking authoritatively about actually is important, because you soon find out the difference between theorizing and reality, as Queers for Palestine definitely would. So there's a lack of that. There's such ideological, there's so ideologically captured groups like Queers for Palestine that they lack there's not even a lot of imagination required to realize why the position you hold is self-contradictory. And the satirical counterfactuals, this is the idea that I think this is what literacy allows you to engage with. Yes, there's the going to the place that would really make concrete the self-contradiction of your position. But I think what literature often does is satirical counterfactuals. It helps process imaginative scenarios that help you realize the truth of things without having to travel all the way to the place. So I think Douglas Murray is completely correct. In an ideal world, if you're going to try and become an expert, go to the source as often as you can. But if not the actual physical source, go to the types of literature that try and engage with the essence of issues, rather than the endless tautological environment of social media. And I think that is the second point I've made there about the history and literature of time travel. The very things that are being cancelled, either in the terms of history, are being cancelled from our culture, or in terms of literature, people just increasingly aren't reading beyond online material. So these things are either being cancelled deliberately or just dying on the vine. And I think this has profound consequences. It creates the self-contradictory bovine stupidity of groups like Queers for Palestine. And then if I can give an example of learning a language, the idea of, I'm trying to get you to, or I'm asking you to think of the idea of you have to go there to understand it. This is what was sneered at by Douglas Murray. But I think there's a different version of you have to go there that isn't about physically going there, but it's related. And if I can explain, years ago, my spoken Spanish is atrocious. But I've always had a fascination with, I did a Spanish qualification at high school in English. It's Spanish A level. So it's relatively advanced up to the age of 18, quite relatively intensive. But it was quite literature based, and it was quite very academically taught. Now you can go to, and I have been to Spain, and if I'd have learned conversational Spanish, there are two aspects to this. If I'd have learned conversational, non-academic, non-credentialed, just practical Spanish, so not from credentialed academics or teachers, but just learned conversational Spanish, yes, it would have been highly useful. But I learned Spanish when I was, it's about 40 years ago now. And it wasn't that long ago I went to Madrid. I hadn't spoken Spanish in years and years. But I got chatting to a taxi driver who turned out was a retired Spanish literature teacher. And with pidgin Spanish, I emphasized my spoken Spanish was atrocious. But I was quoting him sections of books. So there's a play Yerma Federico Garcia Lorca, which is a really obscure, well, not obscure, but it's difficult play. And I could quote sections of it in, in brilliant classical Spanish, whilst then slipping back into pidgin Spanish because my spoken Spanish was so bad. But I had memories of this literature that I'd learned. And I had a fascinating chat. And it's not just that I had a fascinating chat with a Madrid taxi driver. It was that I was engaging with Spanish culture at quite a deep level and could speak to him as a Spanish person in a way that, where is the train station? Can I have 2 beers? You do not get to that level point of contact. And that is the point about credentialed learning of a language. There is expertise in literature that actually has quite odd byproducts and benefits. You're learning the culture. So you're not traveling, you know, I eventually went to Spain quite a few times, but it's not so much about going to the place on its own. It's going to the place in your mind, and then later when you go physically, you're engaging with the deep roots of the culture of that place. The opposite of that would be mass market tourism. And you go there and you consume a culture as a product. And I would suggest that is the one aspect of the importance of literature, the importance of, I think, the arguments people like Douglas Murray advance when they're quoting Milan Kundera. And I think, not always, but sometimes, the podcasting material of someone like Dave Smith is much more like, to use this analogy, travelling on a tourist visa and engaging in tourist activities. That's conceptually what he's doing. He's a tourist in serious areas because he's not engaging in, not credentials for their own sake, but the cultural significance and the work needed to fully understand a situation or a scenario. So there will be scholars looking, and I'm not saying only scholars can talk about Israel-Gaza, but there are journalists, there are scholars who speak either or both Arabic and Hebrew, spent decades studying it, or, as Douglas Murray was saying, at least have gone there and tried to understand it. Or there are tourists talking about the issue. And those tourists talking about the issue have absolute right to do that. But it's also, Douglas Murray has the absolute right to point out they're the equivalent of tourists. So this idea of anti-intellectual bias, I think I mentioned earlier on, but this idea of, I'm under no illusions whatsoever that intellectuals can be very nasty, hypocritical people. So Rousseau famously, I think he had 5 children he gave away to an orphanage whilst writing tomes about good parenting and how to educate young people. Excuse me. Sartre, likewise, not a particularly nice person. You could add Foucault. Heidegger, for a period of time, was a member of the Nazi Party. So not a nice man, but arguably the most important philosopher of the 20th century. So I've mentioned this idea of practical restraint. You do need, I've talked about the balance, Dave Smith and Joe Rogan need the counterbalance of credentialed academics. But likewise, you wouldn't want to live in a world run by intellectuals. It's Plato's Philosopher's King, which the Republic, Plato's Republic, is a fascinating thing to explore, because I think Plato was presenting it as a, how to put it, as almost like a satire or a parody. The Rumspringa of the mind, I think it's interesting. The Amish have this concept of Rumspringa, where as a teenager, you go away, you leave the community and have fun. And when you come back, you're committed for life to the Amish. That strikes me as what university used to be like. But now it's almost like people are in that irresponsible rumspringer of the mind permanently. And then this notion of pre-digested banality. I've been alluding to it, but I do think it's an aspect of the social media podcast environment. And to give you a specific example, Theodore Adorno, The Culture Industry. All mass culture is adaptation. The pre-digested quality of the product prevails, justifies itself, and establishes itself all the more firmly, insofar as it constantly refers to those who cannot digest anything not already pre-digested. It is baby food, based upon the infantile compulsion towards the repetition of needs it created in the first place. If you can just read that for a second, I need to plug in the computer before it runs out. So this escaping the eternal now. From Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, the Greek myth of Narcissus is directly concerned with a fact of human experience, as the word Narcissus indicates. It's from the Greek word narcosis, or numbness. The youth Narcissus mistook his own reflection in the water for another person. This extension of himself by mirror numbed his perceptions until he became the servo mechanism of his own extended or repeated image. The nymph Echo tried to win his love with fragments of his own speech, but in vain. He was numb. He had adapted to the extension of himself and become a closed system. I think that pretty much sums up what I've been trying to explain about the eternal now, the podcast environment, the social media. And then just to finish, the final quote. Again on the theme of Narcissus. Bending over a pool of water, Narcissus quenches his thirst. His image is no longer other. It is a surface that absorbs and seduces him, which he can approach but never pass beyond. For there is no beyond, just as there is no reflexive distance between him and his image. The mirror of water is not a surface of reflection, but of absorption. And apologies now to any regular viewers of the channel, but I'm going to finish with, you must be fed up at the sight of this, but I always think, in all of this discussion about the limits and the weaknesses of podcast, social media type environments, they have many strengths. I'm not completely dismissing them. But this issue of absorption, the mirror of water is not a surface of reflection, but of absorption. I think it's really summarised, and it's what this channel always tries to do, is bring it back to art. But it's just summarised by this Caravaggio picture. And this is what we need to be on our guard against. And in that sense, I was on the side of Douglas Murray. So until the next time, all the very best. Cheers.